In the first part of the JWT authentication episode, we had explained about authenticating a user and generating a token. In this tutorial, we will talk about using the token to fetch authenticated user details and also about refreshing a token, which will be required for securing a token, as it's not a good practice to maintain a single token without expiring it for the user authentication. So let's get started. Let's run our server. So we had the authenticate route defined in the last tutorial. So we are running it again to fetch the token. So it returns a token which we will actually use to fetch the user details. So let's start by just creating a route to fetch all the users. So the current methodology used is not using any authentication. This is just to show the difference between authentication, fetching data based on authentication and without it. So I define a method. The normal index method, and then I'll just directly return all the users. This is not a recommended practice, but just to demonstrate what we are actually trying to achieve, I am going ahead with this approach. So if I run this, it will fetch me all the records. Currently I have only one test data, so that user is being returned. So let me also create let me just create one more method called show, where I'll be fetching a user details based on the ID passed. So I'm just saying user at find, just pass the ID. So this is get user based on ID without authenticating a user. So I'm just saying users with ID as one parameter, method being show. So we have a record with ID is equal to 1. So if we just pass it, it will return that user details. And let's say I don't have a user of ID 2, it will not fetch me any record. So that comes as no record. So let's now start creating a middleware where the authentication will start happening. I have the same set of route groups defined with the version defined as 1, but only difference here being I am defining a middleware where it will be api.auth. So every route defined inside this will have to go through an authentication, let me just pull those two methods which now has to go through the authentication. So if we try running the same route which fetched some data last time, this time around it has to fail. So you can see that the failed authentication because of invalid authorization header. So you will have to add an authorization header for it to work. So for that we'll be using something called as bearer and a token, which is the same token which was generated during authentication. So let's try that. So if you get some 404 not found exception while executing, just check whether your controller has a constructor with some middleware being defined there. So this is one other place where you can define a middleware. So I defined the header with authorization bearer with the token which was returned. So it will right now fetch me the user. So this is going through the proper route mechanism with authentication in place. So whenever the token is mismatched or if it is missing, it will always return an error. So let's check with the user details one. It is also returning, but this is again not the right way of doing if we are trying to access the details of an authenticated user. So let's do that now. So instead of passing the ID, I just, let's say, create a user route, and the show method I get rid of the ID and instead use the JWT auth, which we had defined as a alias in the previous tutorial, and you just need to call a parse token method and convert it into a user. So this is idly parsing the token which is passed as part of the header and translating it into a user. So let's run and see. The root being user, and it returns the user. So this is the right way of returning an authenticated user. Now let's add some format to the code. Let's say the user token passed is invalid. So if the user is not existing, or if the token is invalid, there can be different exceptional cases, like the token can expire, or if it is invalid, or if it is blacklisted. All those scenarios has to be handled through exceptions. So in this case, I'll just return user not found. And if there are some exceptional conditions, the JWT Auth package which we install is providing some of the exception handling cases, like token invalid or token expired. Those all those exceptions can be handled in our handler. So based on the exception type, you can return the message. So this being an API, it's important that we send back the right kind of response back to the client. So in this case, the token has expired. We can handle some other more cases. So then if a token get refreshed, it becomes blacklisted and a new token is generated. So even that scenario has to be handled, so we return that. Some scenarios we handle, and then once that is done, just return the user back to the client. So this is how you return back an authenticated user details. We just call the default compact method and pass the user. So you can also define a response code. So we are not passed the token. So again, maybe we'll have to authenticate the user and get the token. Use that token. And let's make the request again. It's still giving some errors, so let's status code. So let's get rid of that. We'll take it, handle it after seeing the final output. So this should ideally work. So the authenticated user is now returned back. So we had to actually call the set status code and then return 200. So that works fine now. So let's get going with the other features which is required. So one other thing that we can try doing is move the exceptions to a global level instead of calling it every time. We can know the instance of the exception and based on that return it from the exceptions handler.php, which is one of the layers in the Laravel framework. So within the render, you just call the kind of exception that you are expecting and then respond it back from this section. So I have included 3 to 4 kind of exceptions here. So if you identify that your exceptions can be global, then include it here. Otherwise, if it is custom, then include it within your controller itself. So we can actually get rid of many of the global exceptions from here. So I got rid of some of them, and I'll just keep the base JWT exception. And then keep it as some error response which needs to be sent back to the client. So we have the handler ready and we have the authenticated user details ready. So let's just check for a final time, and that works fine. Moving on, let's now create a route to actually refresh a token. This is important because for a user to be authenticated, the token has to be refreshed. That is one of the good practices which needs to be followed. So we will include a method to refresh a token. So let's call it get token, and you can access the current token from the authorization header which we pass using a get token method. Let's see whether that token is received. So whatever we are setting in the header, that same token is returned here. So let's go ahead and include some more bit of code, whether we need to understand or identify whether the token has expired or is it already invalid or blacklisted. So those scenarios we are already included in the exception handler, but we can even include a custom exception here. So let's say this is a method, an exception like the token is invalid. If not, we have to refresh the current token. So for that, all you need to call is the JWT-auth method. Let's call it refresh token. So you just need to call refresh and pass the current token. This will refresh it. Let's add some exception blocks. We'll just go with the basic JWT exception bit. And return the refresh token. So let's see whether we receive the token. Let's execute and see. And if you compare it with the earlier token, you can see that both are different. So it has refreshed the current token. We'll have to use this for future requests. So let's do that. So the earlier one, the token has been blacklisted. Now if you run with the new token, it should fetch you the authenticated user. So let's use the Dingo framework method to return it as a response. Return it as a token array. We don't have because we refreshed, we did not have that token, so let's get a new token. And then it did return. So now if you refresh it, something went wrong. Let's see. So we are returning the token, so it should be the refresh token. So this is the one we'll be refreshing. And it returns a refresh token. So how can we use the tokens? So how could we actually use in different scenarios? Let's say I want to actually delete a user. So I will allow a user to be deleted only if the logged in user is the user who is trying to do it is authenticated. So let's do that. So I'm doing something called as delete. So I might even call the destroy method. And in my controller, I will have a method called destroy. And within the destroy method, I'll try to see whether the user who's trying to do it is authenticated. So that we are checking the header there. So I'll just say authenticate and pass token. So this will make sure that the token that is coming is valid or not, and then I'll just authenticate. So if the user is authenticated, or if not, then I won't let the delete process to happen. So this is one way of handling the authentication. So if everything goes fine, I'll let the user proceed with the functions. Thank you for all the comments and feedbacks we received. Hope this tutorial was helpful. We will continue with something called as transformation of data in the next tutorial, which will make the response data type safe as well as save the client from drastic changes on the server side. Hope to see you soon with the next episode. Keep the likes coming and subscribe to our channel if not already done. See you soon.